Hi, this is Eli Ortiz Oakley, and welcome back to The Rant, the podcast where we pull back the curtain and break down the people, the policies, and the politics of our higher education system. In this episode, I want to take a little bit of time and focus on the politics of a policy in our higher education system, and of course, talk about the people involved. This particular piece of legislation that I want to focus on today is the recent effort in the House of Representatives to create a short-term Pell program. Focused on individuals seeking short-term credentials. We've talked about it on this podcast before. We've brought up this topic, and I've talked about it with many of our guests. Many of our guests have supported this push, and I'm one of those. But let's talk a little bit about some of the politics, and then I want to turn our attention to a conversation I recently had with Rachel Fishman. Rachel is the Director of Education Policy over at New America. New America has weighed in about this bipartisan bill to create a short-term Pell program, and they're not all too happy with the way that this has come out. So I'm going to talk to Rachel about that, push back a little bit on some of the thinking that they've shared, but also try to help everyone understand how they're focused on consumer protection and why they have concerns that they have. We'll also talk about the value of post-secondary education. They publish a report called Varying Degrees, and we'll get into that. But before I talk about Rachel Fishman and get into a conversation with her, I want to weigh in on this short-term Pell program. As I've mentioned, and as you all know, we've talked about short-term Pell on several episodes here on The Rant. I feel it's an important step forward as we think about how to upskill and reskill workers throughout America, workers who may not have had the greatest opportunities to get into a post-secondary education. And this is a way to open the door for them, give them skills and competencies through a quality credentialing program so that they can continue to increase their economic mobility, so that they can be resilient in this economy that's changing every single day, particularly for workers who are in those lowest skilled jobs and opportunities, to give them a chance to gain a skill that'll propel them into a new job or into a new career. Of course, that also means that a short-term credential isn't the end of the road. It's only a beginning step on that road. I still believe, and all my colleagues that I've talked to still believe, that a bachelor's degree is still the greatest lever for lifetime earnings. But in the meantime, there should be many paths to a good paying job and career. And the federal government should be in the business of thinking about how to support or finance those programs in partnership with states and ensuring that there's guardrails to protect the consumer, to protect the learner, and avoid and eliminate the use of predatory practices. So this particular piece of legislation is a bipartisan bill in the House of Representatives, and I know that's shocking to many of you. It's shocking to me. But this bill has support from Congressman Bobby Scott, the ranking Democrat on the House Education and Workforce Committee. And of course, those of you who follow higher education know that Bobby Scott was the longtime chair of the committee, and I've had the pleasure of working with him. He's a very enormously smart, intelligent individual who's very passionate about consumer protection. And the current chair, Dr. Virginia Fox, who together they have proposed this piece of legislation, they have negotiated this piece of legislation, and they both support it. Some of the concerns that have been raised, and one in particular, is how to pay for this piece of legislation. And this piece of legislation has what they call a pay for clause, which essentially shifts money from the wealthiest private colleges in the country. It cuts off the federal student loan program for the nation's wealthiest private institutions. So the Harvards, the Yales, the Ivies of the world. And of course, those institutions are not having the greatest week or the greatest month or the greatest year so far. So it's understandable, or at least it's not surprising, that Congress is going after them. Does this survive the process in Congress, especially once it gets to the Senate? I don't know. I doubt it. But it's interesting to see this particular lever put into it. Nonetheless, this short-term Pell opportunity would create financing through the Pell system for shorter career training programs. In my conversation with Rachel Fishman, we'll get into some of the details of the legislation. She does a wonderful job of articulating some of the details. But essentially, what has caught everybody's attention is that this is a bipartisan effort. We also know that in the Senate, there are champions for short-term Pell. And so it is very likely that something may happen with this program, and then it'll go to the president's desk. We'll see. Still a lot of time, a lot of wrangling. I'm sure a lot of amendments to this legislation before it's all said and done. But it's amazing to think that something might actually happen in higher education policy in Congress. So we'll stay tuned. Now, in the rest of this episode, I want to turn my attention, and you're listening to my conversation with Rachel Fishman from New America. The conversation is audio only. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but I hope that you can hang in there, listen to the audio, because I think it is a fascinating conversation. It's fascinating because depending on where you are on the side of consumer protection, innovation, or just wanting to be more creative in federal policy, it's important to understand the thought process and the concerns of those who are on the other side of a piece of legislation. And in this case, Rachel and her organization, New America, are not big fans of the short-term Pell program, and particularly the way this is designed. And I can certainly see why there would be concern about the pay-for mechanism for this piece of legislation. But nonetheless, there's also concerns about the lack of guardrails that they see currently, whether or not for-profits would be able to offer these programs, whether or not online institutions should offer these programs. And of course, you may have read that New America does not think that online providers should be able to participate in the short-term Pell credentialing program. I happen to disagree with that. I think as long as there's guardrails, you let the marketplace figure out what are the best institutions, what are the best programs to offer, what adds the greatest value, and what attracts the greatest number of learners. I've seen some great fully online programs. Some of you know that as chancellor, I led the creation of what's now Calbright College, which is a fully online competency-based institution. I certainly have been a big fan of Western Governors, of Southern New Hampshire, of many other online programs. So I think there's value there as long as there's the right guardrails and as long as there's the right effort to center the learner in these programs. So with that, I want to turn it over to my conversation with Rachel Fishman. I hope that you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of it. And we will continue to follow this issue and have more to say about it in the new year. So enjoy my conversation with Rachel Fishman from New America. And thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button when you get a chance. Continue to follow us on this YouTube channel. And please leave me your comments. Let me know what you think about the current House version of the short-term Pell program. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, this is Eloy Ortiz Oakley, and welcome back to The Rant, the podcast where we pull back the curtain and break down the people, the policies, and the politics of our higher education system. In this episode, I get to sit down with Rachel Fishman, Director of Education at New America. Rachel leads the education policy work of a very dynamic and influential think and action tank. Rachel has also been involved in New America's work around the well-read education survey called Varying Degrees. I'm going to sit down, Rachel, and ask her several questions about what's going on in higher education these days. But before we do all that, Rachel, welcome to The Rant.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. Thanks for doing this. I know how busy you are, particularly this time of year. So, Rachel, you are the acting director of higher education at New America. You've been involved in higher education policy work for more than 10 years and have been instrumental in the work focused on how Americans think about the value of higher education. However, before we jump into all that great work, let's talk about you. Tell us about your higher education journey and how you landed in your current role at New America.
Yeah, I always love questions like this because when you work in policy, you get asked this question a lot. And what you find out over time is that there are very few routes that are straightforward into these policy roles.
Right.
So, like a lot of policy people, I went to college and I majored in French. I am kidding. That's- There probably aren't a ton of us who majored in French out there. I'm sure there's some of us who majored in French out there. But the reason why I say this is because a lot of people in these policy roles majored in humanities, social sciences, liberal arts. And I think, these majors are really under threat lately. Like, what does that get you in the workforce? And it's like, well, it could get you a job like this if you learn how to be a good communicator, if you learn how to be a good writer, if you learn how to think dynamically and critically about issues, all that these degrees are supposed to give you. Then you can fare very, very well in your career. So this is all to say, don't fret, French majors out there. There is a place for you in the world, and you also get to visit France and speak some French on vacation. So, anyways, I got my French degree and I thought I wanted to go into law. And so, before I went to law school, I worked in a law firm to try and see what that was like.
Hmm.
And this is at the height of the Great Recession. And I got to witness a large reduction in force at the law firm I was working at. I think over the time I was there, 10 to 20% of the workforce was laid off. And I always felt like at any moment my number was going to be called, I was going to be out. So that was really stressful, but I also saw that law was just really not going to be for me. I didn't particularly like what I was engaging in,
Hmm.
and I realized maybe my talents were better off elsewhere. And so I went back to school to pursue another career path in higher education administration because I really valued working with students. I'd done a lot of it as an undergrad. I was an academic advisor, worked in residence life. And so I thought, oh, maybe this is what I really want to do. But what happened while I was in grad school is that I just fell in love with my policy classes. I got to take a few
Hmm.
policy classes with some great thinkers, and it really inspired me. And I also got to work this really great internship in Boston Public Library in the basement, helping students navigate the financial aid process, helping them choose where to go to college, helping them understand what would be the best financial fit and academic fit for me. And in helping these students, I saw that there are just so many policy barriers, particularly at the time with the FAFSA. I filled out so many FAFSAs. It was like something has to change with this. And so I really saw policy at that point as a perfect marriage between my desire to help make things better for low income, first generation students of color, and my love for research, analysis, law, and policy. And that took me right here to Washington, D.C. And that's basically where I've been ever since. I've been at New America for over a decade in a variety of roles. And I've really grown up like over the past 10
Right.
years from policy analyst to director. And I direct our program at New America, where our vision is a higher education system that is accessible, affordable, equitable, and accountable for helping students lead fulfilling and economically secure lives.
Well, thanks for that background, and that's certainly a great framing for our conversation. So let's start with the most recent news in the higher education landscape. There's a lot of talk in Congress, particularly in the House, about short-term Pell. Been a lot of talk in Congress over the last year about short-term Pell. And I know New America has weighed in on a couple of different proposals that have come up, but this latest proposal in the House, I know that you and your colleague Amy there at New America have weighed in pretty aggressively about the proposal. Tell our listeners about this latest proposal in the House to introduce a new short-term Pell program, and what are your concerns about it?
I think short term Pell really is a policy misnomer, and I'm here to unpack that.
Hmm.
So, right now, you can get a Pell Grant for a short term program that's 15 weeks. So right now, you actually can get a Pell Grant for a short-term program that is only a semester's length. When policymakers on the Hill are discussing quote unquote short-term Pell, what they're talking about is expanding Pell to even shorter credentials. At this point, I want to call them teeny tiny credentials, little credentials that are only 8 to 14 weeks long. So we are we are in the future, if this comes to pass, and there's a really good chance that it's going to happen, extending the Pell Grant to certificate programs that are less than half a semester.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've never seen such excitement, bipartisan excitement. I mean, there's so few issues that have bipartisan excitement around
Right.
them, especially like any topic area, but also in higher education. And short-term Pell is just one of those places where policymakers are like, yeah, this is totally awesome. People should get short-term credentials to go to short-term programs like welding, leaving aside the fact that welding programs are actually much, much more than 8 to 14 weeks. So, first of all, again, people are always envisioning longer term programs. But there's just no evidentiary basis for expanding Pell Grants to these very short term programs. They just do not have the economic outcomes that policymakers have been hearing anecdotally, which is why they've been pursuing this. First, again, a lot of policymakers think, oh, you can't get a short-term Pell, when yes, actually you can get a short-term Pell. And then a lot of policymakers think that the outcomes are better than they are. We don't have a lot of data on what the outcomes for these credentials are, but the data that we do have, New America's done an analysis,
Mm-hmm.
and 40% of people who earn these very, very short term credentials are unemployed after they earn them. That's not a great outcome. That's a terrible outcome. And then most are on average earning poverty level wages. And where it gets really damning is that when you break that down by Black students, by Latinx students, by particularly women, you see even lower suppressed wages, ten to $20,000 lower than those poverty level earnings that I mentioned. So, don't have a lot of evidence to do
Mm-hmm.
this. And what evidence we do have is that we shouldn't do this. So, lots of concerns about short-term Pell, and I think the answer really, if it moves forward, as it moves forward, is that there are lots of guardrails from a consumer protection standpoint that really prevent students from enrolling and using their time and their Pell Grant lifetime eligibility on these programs. And so that's what we're really monitoring at New America, is the various guardrails that are within the various pieces of legislation.
Right. And I certainly appreciate that last point. The guardrails are critically important so that any new investment on the part of the federal government is going to its directed target, which are individuals who need skills to get into the workforce, to upskill themselves, to get a chance to better participate in economic mobility that we want for them. I've talked to a lot of folks on my podcasts. This issue has come up a lot. People I talk to, particularly in the community colleges, are excited about the possibility. So let me pose to you the other side of this argument, and tell me your thoughts about how you would craft guardrails, particularly as we think about the recently developed gainful employment regs by the Department of Education. I think are potential guardrails for some of this work having to prove that these programs actually lead to earnings, making sure that these programs are not terminal programs, that they continue to lead to higher level credentials. Because I think most of the people I talk to have no argument with, the bachelor's degree being that greatest lifelong lever for economic mobility. But also on the flip side, there's lots of bachelor's degrees that we fund through Pell that also lead to poverty wages. I think Michael Itzkowitz has done a lot of work highlighting some of that. So how do you see the other side of this coin and the enthusiasm, the bipartisan enthusiasm, particularly from folks in community colleges who have been thinking about this a lot? How do you reconcile the two sides of this argument?
This is a great question. So I think the good news, despite still very valid concerns
Right.
about the legislation, is that there are guardrails within the legislation that we see. To your point, I think any short-term Pell legislation moving forward is going to have important earnings thresholds, earnings gains. I think a big one is excluding the for-profit sector.
Hmm.
So you were talking about community colleges. Community colleges do a lot of this training, but the for-profit institutions tend to, when they get their hands on taxpayer dollars, they tend to exploit, and they tend to be
Hmm.
predatory, and they tend to grow their programs very quickly. So making sure that's one way to make sure that we don't sort of open the floodgate to these programs, and having them just turbocharge and grow before we really understand and see their outcomes. And then another similar guardrail would be to prevent online programs from participating. One of the reasons why policymakers say they want to do this expansion is because people need to have training for very hands-on careers. You can't have training for a hands-on career if you're doing it online. So sort of excluding online programs from accessing something like a short-term Pell is important to, again, prevent that massive and sudden growth, and also keep fidelity with making sure that the degrees are for those hands-on certificates that policymakers say that their regions really need, and which is why we need this program.
Hmm.
I mean, in general, and I know we're going to talk about value today, when it comes to the work we see from Mike, as you mentioned, about bachelor's
Hmm.
degrees, some bachelor's degrees not having a good payoff either. I think it's important that one of the reasons I think value is faltering in this nation, or perception of value of higher education is faltering in this nation, is that things have gotten really expensive.
Right.
People have to borrow a lot of loans, or there's at least a sense that people have to borrow a lot of loans to afford it. And then you see data that it's not worth it. And so I think this just points to, in general, not just for these short-term programs, not just for career-oriented gainful employment programs, we need oversight writ large on higher education to make sure that students are meeting some minimum benchmarks, not high benchmarks. We're not going to
Right.
expect teachers to make a ton of money, and we're not going to expect social workers to make a ton of money, but low benchmarks, such as, did you graduate and can you make more than somebody in your state who has just a high school degree? I mean, that is a very low benchmark that is common and
Hmm.
for a lot of institutions, and students and families deserve to know that information when they're enrolling in these programs.
Well, we completely agree with you. I know in my day job at the College Futures Foundation, those are the kind of questions we're going to be digging into for our learners in California, getting more and better information to the learner and their families. Now, before we move to specifically talking about value, let me ask you one last thing about this short-term Pell proposal, because I think it's caused a lot of kerfuffle. The pay-for aspect of the proposal, how this would actually be paid for. You all have raised some serious concerns about that. Can you explain to our listeners exactly what that aspect of the proposal?
Oh my goodness. Hang on to your seats,
Right.
folks, because if you haven't been paying attention, here's where things get really interesting. So all along the way, we're all going like, okay, sure, short-term Pell, don't love this. Hope it has a lot of guardrails. Reading through the legislation, you get to page like 27, and it's like, here's how we're going to pay for it. I think it's important to note this was a bipartisan agreement. So
Hmm.
this is a bipartisan bill between the chairwoman, Representative Fox of the Education Workforce Committee in the House, ranking member Scott, who's also on that committee. So, I mean, that just shows like how much negotiation went into this, and
Right.
the pay for is that any school that faces the endowment tax, so that's, I think, like 34, it's in the low 30s, institutions. So these are the really
Hmm.
wealthy private institutions in the nation, that they would no longer be able to participate in the federal student loan program. So they would no longer be able to disperse any federal student loans to undergraduates, and this one's really important because I think this has bigger implications for these schools, any graduate students. So that includes the Graduate
Mm-hmm.
Plus loan program.
Wow. That's definitely going to cause a lot of interest as this gets out in the news, and it'll, I'm sure, create quite a debate.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of slipped under the radar because the wealthier institutions, right, we're not paying attention
Mm-hmm.
to the short-term Pell legislation because, to your point, this is more, these types of programs happen much more in the community college sector, in the for-profit sector. It's not really what you would see at these wealthy, high endowment institutions. So
Right.
they've just, been going along, not paying attention, and then all of a sudden, this gets unveiled, it gets marked up this week, it's moving very quickly. And I think it's just been challenging to raise the alarm bells on it because we think, this opens up. First of all, short-term Pell could lead to predatory programs for low-income students of color who just want a short-term credential and just get out of higher
Mm-hmm.
education. But it also leads to equity implications for particularly for students of color who are trying to access prestigious law and medical schools. You usually have to borrow. I mean, Harvard doesn't give like full that I know of. I mean, maybe I'm
Mm-hmm.
speaking out of turn, but most medical schools aren't like, we're giving you a full ride to attend our medical school. Medical education's really expensive, and we want people to be able to access these graduate schools, even if it means loans, because we know if you go to, Harvard Medical School, you're going to be able to pay back your loan. And so it's potentially cutting off routes of access to low income students of color to these prestigious grad schools. And we should all be really worried about that.
I agree. We should be worried about this whole conversation because I think, certainly if you're one of the wealthy schools right now, one of the more rejected schools right now, you've had a really tough couple of weeks.
Yep.
So let's jump into the value question because I think this dovetails very well. There is an erosion of confidence, particularly in the wealthiest institutions, those institutions that we have held up highest on the value proposition in the past. There's a lot of concern about cost, a lot of concern about indebtedness. And so you all have been looking at this question of post-secondary value for some time. You've published a survey over the last several years titled Varying Degrees. Tell us about what you found in your recent survey and how these perceptions of value are changing over time.
For those who don't know, Varying Degrees is a nationally representative annual survey on American adults' perceptions of higher education. So we explore issues related to value of higher education, how Americans think it should be funded, and how we should hold higher education accountable for that funding, whether it be student investment, taxpayer investment. What's great about the survey is that and what makes it so powerful, to your point, we've been doing this for years now. So we actually just signed, we're just in the process of signing off on our instrument for 2024.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been doing this since 2017, and it really allows us to understand perceptions over a time period that, I mean, you think about life in 2017, that
Right.
this period has been full of political and economic upheaval. And so, how exactly in our survey have perceptions changed or not changed over time? And one of the questions we've asked all 7 years is whether Americans think higher ed is just fine the way it is. Like, that's the way it was phrased. We asked that on day one. Maybe I would have rephrased it differently if I could like rewind time. But it's really a temperature check question, to understand, like, at this moment in time, like, how are you feeling about higher education?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay? Is it working? And when we first collected data, this was one of our big findings. Only 1 in 4 thought higher education was fine the way it is. What's interesting is that people are still in the minority on this question, but we've seen it increase over the years to 40%. 40% of Americans say higher ed is fine the way it is. Um, so we find that very interesting. We're trying to unpack that a little bit more this year
Mm.
when we go into field. But overall, like, there are some good things when you look at the data. A sizable majority believe that a close family member should go to higher education, that they would recommend it because it leads to economic security. They generally agree that those who complete a post-secondary education have better jobs, more opportunities to build wealth, that they contribute to their communities in a variety of ways via tax revenues, a skilled workforce. And so you might be sitting there thinking, wait, hold on a second. I've seen some really bad polling
Right.
data saying exactly the opposite. What the heck is going on? Wasn't there a Paul Tough article on this issue in the New York Times Magazine recently that kind of was unpacking all of this and how Americans don't really believe in higher ed that much anymore? And so, what I say to that is that yes, our data paint a more positive picture. And so I don't think things are as bad as they seem, but we have certainly picked up on what I would call this simmering pessimism about higher education over time that really does seem to be taking hold. So I told you about a whole host of questions about value where people in general, like when you aggregate up, that people feel like fairly positive about things.
Hmm.
But new this year, we did a demographic cluster analysis where we tried to understand how different people cluster on their thoughts about value. And what we discovered is that 52 of Americans just are higher ed believers. They're like, sign me up. Everybody needs education. Everybody needs more and more education to have an economically secure life. And then 48%, which is really, really high, are skeptics. They are not on board with higher education and its value proposition
Hmm.
all, just not at all. And to give you a quick overview, like what does this actually look like? Like who are the believers? Who are the skeptics? What do they believe and what are they skeptical about? So the believers nearly all think graduates benefit more economically and socially compared to those without, so that there's a huge economic benefit to individuals. They also think there's a huge societal benefit to having people get more education in terms of tax revenues, contributing to their communities. And most think that colleges and universities are having a positive impact in the direction of this country right now.
Hmm.
And they think, like I said, more and more education, the more education you have, the better. Everybody should get as much education as they should possibly get because that's going to make you lead a much better life and get more wealth and all of those good things. Meanwhile, the skeptics, they literally see no benefit to a graduate
Wow.
compared to those without credentials. None. Very few believe there are any social benefits compared to those without credentials, though they do believe they do see some social benefits. So they're not like totally negative there, but they are negative when it comes to a personal return on investment. And they're more likely to think colleges are having a negative impact on the way things are going in this country. So
Hmm.
you're probably wondering, like, who are these people, right? Who are these just are the believers Democrats and are the skeptics Republicans? We do a lot of Democrat Republican analysis because we're situated in Washington, D.C., and we talk to federal policymakers and we do federal policy research. But I'm here to tell everyone that the believers are not all Democrats. While a plurality of them are 43%, a full fifth of believers are Republicans. So you still have a full fifth
Right.
that would consider themselves Republicans. Similarly, skeptics are more likely to be Republican, but a full quarter are Democrats. So this just isn't about it being partisan. And I like to leave people with this. I know I've been rambling on and on about our data, but what I find most concerning about what we saw in the data was that for our higher education skeptics, 40% believe that all you need in this nation for economic security is just a high school diploma and not a credit, not a single credit of higher education. And an additional 22% said all you need is one of those short-term technical certificates, which I just said don't usually lead to the returns we would like to see. And so it's just wild, the dissonance to me, because we have so much economic data to show that I don't know why you think a high school diploma is sufficient. We have a lot of data showing otherwise. And so we should all be concerned about that.
Absolutely. And I think this is a huge alarm bell for my colleagues who are leading institutions of higher education throughout the country. We've been seeing an erosion in confidence in the institutions for years since the Great Recession. And this is just another reminder that we just need to do a much better job of, one, clearing the path for learners so that they can access those institutions more clearly, more readily, in greater numbers, lower the cost of attendance, and show clear value for the work that they're doing. Clearly articulate the programs and curriculum with the economic mobility outcomes that they want to see. So I think it is an important lesson for policymakers, but also for the leaders in these institutions. They can't just throw up their hands and say, we're doing the best that we can. Clearly, we're not doing the best that we can. Let me ask you this. You're looking at the landscape of higher education from your perch there at New America. A lot of uncertainty gripping higher education institutions these days. There's an enrollment decline. We've just seen, concerns raised about student voices on campus, protests, concerns about DEIA on campuses. As you look at this from your perspective, what do you see are some of the biggest challenges that our listeners should be paying attention to?
Right now, the left is really focused, or the left movement, is really focused on forgiving student loan debt, right?
Right.
The right is really focused on getting rid of loans, or not necessarily getting rid of them or capping them. Like, oh, people are borrowing too many loans. So the solution is don't let them borrow as much loan. Like, you're not
Right.
really looking at the cost part of the equation. And to your point, they're really focused on sort of the free speech on campus, culture wars. We saw the challenges with the hearing a couple of weeks ago about anti-Semitism on campus, and all of this is sort of sucking a lot of oxygen out of the room to have the policy discussions that we really need to have. I think when you talk so much about forgiving debt, and there's been a lot of media coverage of forgiving debt, what happens is that you're signaling to students and families that higher education isn't worth it.
Mm.
Like, you shouldn't borrow to go pursue a degree because it's just not going to pay off for you. And so it's sort of on its face, the debt cancellation conversation actually undermines the access to higher education conversation. Similarly, when, Republicans just want to cap loans without addressing costs, well, that's certainly going to cut off access as well. They think what policymakers really need to figure out is, were we even to be able to hit some sort of like boop magic button that's just like that someone has somewhere that's like, the debt is forgiven. We would also need a button that was like boop, and now everything's affordable for the
Right.
people who need to
Exactly.
afford colleges. And so we really need to grapple with, like, how do we answer that question? In many ways, it's like the questions are disassociated when they have to be reassociated. So how do we make higher education more affordable? And when we do make higher education more affordable, how do we make it more accountable? I know there's a lot of movements to make college free, and that's a very challenging policy, right? But a lot of states are putting these policies into place and promise programs and all sorts of things. But how can we get the state and federal government to come to the table and to help fund higher education together? But then, if we do that, and that's really what will change the equation, how do we hold states accountable to
Right.
maintain their investment? And how do we hold institutions accountable for that investment as well, to make sure, as we were talking about, that students are graduating at least making more than a high school graduate would have made, that institutions aren't then suddenly leveraging their own financial aid dollars like we see the elite institutions do. They'll literally figure out ways to offer their own merit aid while using federal aid to offer different types of financial aid packages to different types of students. So, how do we hold institutions accountable for maintaining that affordability for students that need them most? And so those are really the big questions. And then I would say overall, another big one that policymakers have to grapple with is, how do we promote the dismantling of structural racism in the ways in which our higher education is resourced and where institutions land. Like we know, for example, that HBCUs have been chronically underfunded. We know that, like, I think it's a majority or most community colleges are Hispanic serving institutions at this point. So, and they tend to be very under resourced. So we tend to throw so much money, states particularly in their subsidy models, to, flagship wealthy institutions when really the whole equation needs to change so that we are providing pathways for the lowest income students so that they do have an opportunity to get the credential that they want to get that will give them the best labor market return.
So let me ask you one final question, Rachel, as we begin to close. We've talked about what's going on, what's happened in the past. Let's talk about the new year. As you think about 2024, what excites you the most about the work that New America is diving into?
It's funny because it's the end of the year, so I'm just like trying to get a bunch of stuff done, as I'm sure everybody else is trying to get a bunch of stuff. It's such a stressful time. December is terrible. But I think there's a couple of things. One, we're going to continue to build our team. And I say this because a lot of people are like, they don't mention like the teamwork that goes into policy work. So I firmly believe that ego is the enemy of good policy work. And so it's really dependent on the people that you work with, and the content flows from that. So really building up our team in the new year. We have someone new joining us in January, which is going to be exciting. But also content wise, I am really interested in keeping an eye on what's going on with short-term Pell, continuing to be one of the lonely voices that's like, hey, hold on, wait a second. This is perhaps like not the best way forward, or how can this be a better way forward?
Right.
I'm doing a lot of work with some of my colleagues on cosmetology programs. How could we better structure cosmetology? If anybody's looked at the gainful employment data on cosmetology, it's really
Yeah,
bad.
really bad.
And so trying to figure out like how can we make that better and more student friendly. And then I also do a lot of work on again, because I just feel at my heart and core, I'm a consumer protection advocate, on financial aid award letters, offers, packages. They're very confusing to navigate right now for students and families. Often they don't include cost information. They like combine grants, loans, and work study, making it seem that students have like a full ride when they really don't. And it's just there's no other financial product that I can think of that's as expensive as higher education that doesn't have a common disclosure of what the price and aid is. So we've really been advocating for financial aid offer reform. There's a great piece of legislation called the Understanding the True Cost of College Act that would look to make financial aid offers much more decipherable by students and families. So looking to continue the drumbeat on that work in the new year, because that's another one that has bipartisan support. So again, there's few things with bipartisan support. So what does have bipartisan support? We'll see if it can get over the finish line in this Congress. So I have some hope there.
Right. Well, listen, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me and give your thoughts and perspective about what's going on. I really appreciate the work that you're leading there at New America and the work in general that New America has done for higher education policy throughout the last several years. So, Rachel, thanks for being with us, and I hope you enjoyed your time here on The Rant.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for having me again.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining me here on The Rant. If you enjoyed this episode, hit the like button. Let me know your thoughts about the conversation that Rachel and I just had, particularly if you have thoughts about short-term Pell. I know we'll be talking about this more and more over the next couple of months. To hear more episodes, hit subscribe. You can always follow us on YouTube as well as all of your favorite podcast platforms. Take care, everybody, and thanks for joining us.